Thank you so much, Skip and Nikolai and all the others who have been involved in making this event possible. When I was here the last time to talk about that book on the spread of legalized gambling throughout the South, you all were in the midst of deciding whether or not to authorize the legislature to create a lottery. And my talk was right in the middle of that campaign. It was not an advocacy talk. I wasn't pro or con. I was trying to explain what was going on that had led so many southern states already to legalize casinos or adopt a state lottery. But somebody asked me in the question and answer, so what's your opinion? And I said, well, I'm not going to give you my opinion, but I'm going to give you the best arguments for and the best arguments against based on the experience of all the states that have lotteries. And one of the things I said under the heading, I guess, of arguments against is that all the research shows that if you have a lottery, the people who buy lottery tickets are going to be poor and working class people, and most of the benefits are going to go to middle class and upper middle class period, and that's, you know, on the pluses and minuses ledger, that's a minus. Well, the next day, I got back to Memphis, and somebody sent me what turned out to be the lead article in the next day's Arkansas Democrat Gazette. Now, I'm used to laboring in obscurity. But Bill Halter, who was lieutenant governor then and kind of the chief advocate for the lottery, not Bill Halter, but I'll read you what his spokesman said when presented with the fact that I had given a mixed assessment of the lottery. This is from the article that appeared in the paper. Halter spokesman Bud Jackson said, Arkansans, this is now quoting from Bud Jackson, Arkansans are smart enough to trust the facts over some kooky college professor trying to turn a quick buck with a book. Well, here I am, once again, Bud Jackson, I'm at it again. When I asked Skip how long I should speak for before turning the floor over to any questions or comments you may have, he said about 20 minutes, and my mind instantly flashed back to an end of semester course evaluation. You know, if you teach college now, at the end of the semester, the students get to anonymously comment on the experience they've had. And one student wrote, and his comment began on the front page and then continued on the back page. And on the front page, it said, if I were told I only had 20 minutes to live, I would choose to spend that time in Professor Nelson's class. Like, oh, that's so nice. I can't wait to see what he wrote on the back. Well, what he wrote on the back was, because it would seem like 20 hours. So I hope when I'm done talking, I hope when I'm done talking today, you don't feel like it's 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Resilient America is the title of this book. You all have a sheet in front of you which includes a lot of the things I'm not going to say in my 20 minutes about the book, because I'm going to focus on kind of the big picture in these prepared remarks. But along the way, studying that election, both what led up to it and what followed it, I found lots of sort of little issues to offer an interpretation on. So would JFK have dropped LBJ from the ticket in 1964? Would Hubert Humphrey have benefited from distinguishing himself from President Johnson on Vietnam earlier rather than later in the campaign? And so take this as kind of an a la carte menu. If there's anything on these sheets that catches your interest and you want to ask about it, I'd be glad to engage that. But as I say, my main purpose here in this part of the program is to give you the big picture. Resilient America, and I knew when I got into the book on this election that unless I really screwed it up, it was going to be a fascinating story, because the cast of characters in 1968, Lyndon Johnson, Robert F. Kennedy, Gene McCarthy, Hubert Humphrey, George Wallace, Richard Nixon, Nelson Rockefeller, Ronald Reagan, Spiro Agnew, Edmund Muskie. I mean, the list goes on. And when you think of the events that took place that year, I knew that there was a great story here to be told, which hadn't been told between the covers of a book in quite a few years. And I hope to bring some new insights and some new data sources of information, and then come out of all this study after telling the story and introducing the characters and so on, come out with something interesting to say. And what I came out with after I finished the substantive research on the book was a sense that the story, as I had uncovered it, very different from the conventional view of the election. The conventional view of 1968 in general and of the 68 election in particular was that this was a story of America coming apart at the seams. And believe me, a lot of grist for that interpretation, which I'll review in just a minute. But I came away thinking that the big story about this election and its aftermath was America holding together in the face of enormous stress. Resilient America. And it's interesting that I'm speaking here because one of the things that occurred to me when I was arriving at this interpretation was a statement that is attributed to Bill Clinton, I think in John Harris's book, The Survivor, which in my view is still the best book out there on the Clinton presidency. But Harris quotes Clinton as having said one time, and we all know he had his adversity, that Clinton said, "You remember when we were kids and they used to have these inflatable rubber toys, life-sized, and on that would be painted the image of a boxer." I had one when I was a kid. It was Joe Palooka. Anybody here remember Joe Palooka, the cartoon character? And he said, you could hit that thing and knock it down, but it would bounce right back. And you could hit it again even harder, and it would go down, and it would bounce back. And he said, I'm that rubber doll. That's resilience, right? Not that life for an individual or life for a nation is stress-free. Sometimes the stress is overwhelming. It's enough to tear you apart. But resilience is when it doesn't tear you apart. Resilience is when you can take the strain and recover from it. In fact, oddly enough, if you go to Amazon and type in resilient or resilience into the search box, last time I did that, it generated something like 4,000 titles. And almost all the titles are books about how to survive a business setback or how to survive a personal crisis. But interestingly enough, resilience is a term borrowed from the study of metals, of metallurgy. And it originated with the definition of the ability of a metal, piece of steel or whatever, when it's subjected to great stress and bent out of shape, the ability of that piece of metal to regain its shape. Kind of a nice image when you think about sometimes how great the stresses on nations and individuals are. Well, I said earlier that in offering this interpretation, and I'll elaborate on it a little bit more later, but that I was kind of bucking the conventional historical interpretation, which was that this election is a story of America coming apart at the seams. And I said, and this is a good way to go through that year, there's certainly a lot of evidence for that side of the argument, right? Think about January, end of January, the beginning of the new year in Vietnam, Tet. And after months of hearing from the administration and the generals of our forces in Vietnam that we had finally turned the corner and the communist forces were no longer capable of mounting a sustained attack, we found out at the end of January that not only were the communist forces able to maintain a sustained attack, at least for a period, but able to occupy the capital city, Saigon, and even occupy the American embassy for a period of hours. Turned out to be, at the end, a great military victory for the United States, but the assurance that somehow the war was drawing to a close because the communists couldn't fight anymore, that was gone. 6 weeks later, in New Hampshire, the first primary of the year took place, and someone who had begun his campaign as a rather quixotic challenger, the anti-war candidate, Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota, challenging President Johnson for the Democratic nomination. Nobody thought he had a chance of doing anything against an incumbent president. And he wins a strong majority of the delegates in that state and nearly a majority of the popular vote in that state. The kind of setback presidents almost never face when they're seeking the renomination of their party. And then a few days later, Senator Robert F. Kennedy of New York, the brother, of course, of the slain president, decides to get into the race and challenge Johnson as well. Kennedy had been holding back. He was obviously the first choice for Democrats who opposed the war to challenge Johnson, but he had held back for two reasons. One is he didn't think it was possible, realistically, to expect to defeat an incumbent president for his party's nomination, and if you did, you would go into the general election so weakened that it would be very difficult to win. He was also thinking that his personal relationship with Johnson, which was one of hatred, two-way street, would mean that any effort he made to run against Johnson would invariably be interpreted by the press as a personal vendetta rather than a campaign about issues. But now that McCarthy had shown that Johnson was vulnerable and Robert F. Kennedy could not be accused of dividing the party by getting into the race, he gets into the race, which is Lyndon Johnson's literally worst nightmare. He had nightmares about this. Suddenly it was coming true. And so at the end of that month of March, 1968, Skip, do you remember this speech? I was watching it with the brothers of Pi Lambda Phi in college. President Johnson gives yet another primetime televised speech on the Vietnam War. Back then, there were only 3 networks, so that was the only thing that was on. The audience was massive for any presidential speech at that time. And then at the end, surprises almost everyone by saying, as your president, I will not seek nor will I accept the nomination of my party for another term as president. He was out of the race. Nobody saw this coming. A few days later, less than a week later, in my city of Memphis, the first assassination, unfortunately not the last assassination, but the first assassination of the year takes place, the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was in Memphis to support striking sanitation workers seeking better working conditions, shot down in that city, and overnight, riots broke out in the inner cities of over 100 cities, including Washington, D.C., where the rioting got so close to the White House, so close to the Capitol, that the Secret Service told Vice President Hubert Humphrey, who was in New York and wanted to get back to Washington, we can't take you to your office in the Senate because it's too dangerous, and we can't take you to your office in the Executive Office building next to the White House because it's too dangerous. Robert F. Kennedy, as Skip reminded me, over lunch that night went to Indianapolis against the advice of the mayor, without the protection of the police, went and spoke to an African-American audience that had gathered, many of whom had not even heard the news of King's assassination, and spoke words that brought a certain amount of peace and rededication to that group. For one of the few times ever Kennedy spoke in public about the fact that he had suffered a loss as well. He knew what it was like to lose somebody who meant so much to him. And Indianapolis was one of the cities that did not riot. The battle goes on. Vice President Humphrey decides to enter the race. He does it at the end of April. Now, isn't that after the primaries? Yeah, but back in 1968, you still didn't have to win primaries to win your party's nomination. In fact, most delegates were chosen by state party leaders, and Humphrey knew that if he waited long enough, he wouldn't have to enter any primaries, but could count on the support of labor leaders and Southern party leaders and big city bosses and so on to carry him through to the nomination. About a month later, Robert F. Kennedy wins the California primary. He is shot that night, leaving the rally at which he had just spoken to his supporters and not making his way out of the room the usual way, through the crowd. And that's where his bodyguards had already cleared a path for him. But he had been told, you need to go talk to the reporters, and the quickest way to go meet the reporters is through the kitchen. And there waited a young man named Sirhan Sirhan, who killed Kennedy with a pistol. Riots, assassinations, presidents dropping out, challengers getting in. That summer in Chicago, hand-to-hand combat on Michigan Avenue, right outside the convention hotels between the Chicago City Police and the several thousand anti-war protesters, most of them children of the middle class, many of them first-generation college students against the war. And all year long, by the way, the third-party candidacy of Governor George Wallace of Alabama, who is an interesting figure in many, many ways, but the main thrust of whose campaign was playing on the resentments of those who were not young and not black and who were looking at these events taking place and thinking, what's happening to my country? I don't like those people. I don't like what they're saying. I don't like what they're doing. A kind of undertone of violence all through that year whenever Wallace spoke before audiences. Now, that sounds like America coming apart to me. Meanwhile, though, there's a campaign going on for the Republican nomination. And unlike the Democratic campaign, unlike the third-party campaign of George Wallace, the Republican campaign is unfolding in a very routine way, right? You've got a candidate of what was then the significant sort of Eastern liberal wing of the party. First, that was George Romney. By the way, one of his campaign workers was a 15-year-old kid named Willard, also known as Mitt. When Romney's campaign fizzled, in comes Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York, famous around here, of course, as the brother of the real Governor Rockefeller, right? On the right, the wing of the party that had gained the nomination in '64 in getting the Republicans to choose Barry Goldwater, their new champion, this new figure on the political scene, but a very familiar figure in people's living rooms, the 18-month governor of California, Ronald Reagan. And then in the middle, just about what you'd expect, somebody somewhere in between, former vice president, former presidential candidate, former candidate for governor of California, Richard Nixon. Extraordinary thing. Nixon had lost in 1960 to Kennedy. And what he thought was, I don't want to run against Kennedy again in '64. So I'll run for governor of California in '62. And that'll be the equivalent of a 6-inch putt. Obviously, I'll win for that. And that way I can promise I'll serve a full term, and that'll get me out of running in '64, and I'll run again in '68 when Kennedy won't be on the ballot anymore. Well, Nixon loses overwhelmingly to the father of Jerry Brown, Governor Pat Brown of California, and in the immediate aftermath of that defeat, holds a press conference and says, "This is my last press conference, gentlemen. I'm getting out of politics. You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore." And he actually moved to New York City to practice law. I mean, people really took him at his word. But come '66, come '68, the approach of '68, Kennedy's now gone, the Democrats are in turmoil, and Nixon didn't see any obvious front runner for the Republican nomination, and so he got back in and ran as the candidate who was not as conservative as Reagan, not as liberal as Romney or Rockefeller, but one who represented kind of the broad, moderate conservative wing of the Republican Party. And what Nixon realized was he had to overcome this image as a loser. So he entered every primary he could, and he won them all. Now, I think in hindsight, we think of Nixon as in many ways an inauthentic individual. Certainly critics think of Nixon as an inauthentic individual. But I will say this, his appeal to the voters in 1968, which turned out to be enough to win the election, was intensely authentic. It was based, first of all, on what he presented as his credentials as a foreign policy statesman. And that was authentically part of who Nixon was, somebody who knew a lot, cared about foreign policy. And the other part of Nixon's appeal to the voters was what you might call cultural populism, not old-style Arkansas populism, which involves attacking the fat cats on Wall Street, but a new kind of populism which involves attacking the professors and network news anchors and journalists who represent a kind of cultural elite, seen in opposition to the values of what Nixon called the silent majority. Nixon was that too. And through the course of the year, he ended up narrowly prevailing. Now, in the aftermath of that election in 1968, Here's where the resilience comes in. There were a lot of people who were intensely angry. If you were against the war in Vietnam, and that represented a substantial share of the population, then you hadn't had a candidate to vote for in November of that year who shared your opposition to the war. You felt alienated from the process. Or if you were an African American voter and saw the results come in, maybe from a neighborhood that had been burned down in riots, you weren't happy with the results of that election. On the right, if you were a Wallace supporter, and there were 10 million of them who voted for Wallace in that election, you weren't happy with the result. There was a lot of dissatisfaction in the country after that year, and again, this general sense of the process is falling apart, the system is breaking. What happened after that election? I would argue that what happened afterward is where the resilience of the American constitutional system and the American two-party system really came into play and helped what had seemed to be a country spinning out of orbit to come back with some reasonable semblance of unity. Nixon and a Democratic Congress. Nixon, by the way, was the first president to be elected since 1848 without a Congress of his own party. And that turned out to be a good thing in the short run, because you had Nixon representing, obviously, a plurality of voters as a Republican. You had a Congress that was controlled by the Democrats. And those congressional Democrats sort of took the lead on issues of opposition to the war, took the lead on issues of pumping money into the most impoverished minority neighborhoods in the country. And Nixon, on matters of domestic policy in particular, was content to go along. So you see a lot of efforts in Congress, some of them successful, to meet the concerns of those on the political left who had been so alienated. And Nixon is really not standing in the way. He's the president who signed the bill bringing into existence the Environmental Protection Agency. He's the president who signed the bill bringing into existence the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. He's the president who signed the bill increasing Social Security benefits 20% and then indexing it to inflation in subsequent years. He's also the president who introduced what amounted to a guaranteed income for all people regardless of other credentials. Didn't get passed, but Nixon and the Democratic Congress were certainly appealing to those dissatisfied voters on the left. And more than that, as long as we're talking about them, the Democratic Party and then both parties changed their nominating process so that delegates to the next convention would not be chosen by a handful of party leaders meeting in smoke-filled rooms, but would be chosen through open primaries, open caucuses, where any voter could have a voice. And so lots of dissatisfied, anti-war Democrats coming out of '68 thought, well, we can go into the game now and we can play it fair. And they became the basis of the George McGovern candidacy in '72. Now, was that a good choice for the Democrats? You could argue that, but was it a way of getting people who were alienated from the system to come back into the system and try to make it work? Absolutely. On the right, those Wallace voters, now Nixon spent a lot of time trying to win over their support, and very successfully. Essentially, he got every Wallace voter 4 years later in 1972. But when the Democrats opened up their nominating process, Wallace decided that in '72 he would run for the Democratic nomination, knowing that he could go into primary states and win primaries and get delegates and have a voice. He ended up getting shot himself in May of '72. My point is, and I'm going to wrap things up here because I so much want to hear from you. My point is that the system responded to the dissent that had created the coming apart that was there at the end of the year. The system opened up enough doors for people who were unhappy with the way the system had performed in '68 that they didn't feel their only alternative was violent revolution, that they did feel there are now ways we can play within the rules and have our voices heard and have our voices make a difference. And that, to me, is the essence of resilience, is a constitutional system of government bouncing back from extraordinary stresses. Well, let me leave it at that and open the floor for any questions or any comments you may have.
Thanks, Mike. Very well done. Arkansas was one of those states that voted for George Wallace.
That's right.
Along with Winthrop Longfellow, along with J. William Fulbright that year. It made us as schizophrenic as we are today. Because no one can explain that vote, and I wouldn't attempt to try. Yes, questions right here.
There are two things you brought up which were critical at this time. One was the primary system. The other was strong two-party system. Would you comment on both of those factors and how they've worked out in politics and in government today, whether they're positive or negative?
Well, not surprisingly, the answer is there have been positives and negatives, right? I mean, the great advantage of the two-party system is that it clarifies the choice for voters, number one. Number two, each party, in order to attain a majority, and you don't win anything if you don't get a majority, each party has to go about the business of building coalitions within it and bringing people together within it. In European countries where there are multiple parties, then that happens, but it happens after the election because no party can win a majority in the election itself. So the coalition forming goes on and the voters really have no say because it takes place after the election. So I'm a strong supporter of the two-party system, but I love the safety valve. You know, George Wallace was tapping into grievances that were authentically there, just as Ross Perot did in '92. And one of the consequences of that kind of candidacy is that whoever wins the election realizes, I need to somehow find a way of speaking to the expressed concerns of those millions of voters. And that's one of the ways in which the two-party system kind of responds to that kind of challenge. Somebody's compared third parties, because they tend not to last, at least the ones that get a lot of votes, to a bee that stings and dies. But the legacy there is the bee sting. And whoever wins the election has to take account of the fact that bee has stung, and unless, I'm now losing my metaphor here, but unless the concerns of that group of voters are addressed in some way, then their administration will fail. The open primary system, I don't know what the alternative is. I don't think there's any way of going back to the days when, as a country, we would trust a relatively small number of people to say, here are your two candidates. And I think over time, the parties and the voters have adapted to the fact that this is a lengthy, complex process that gives everybody a chance to have a say, but also really puts the candidates for the presidency under a lot of the challenges they will face as president. Challenges of endurance, challenges of ability to change, to adapt to changes in the governing environment or the political environment, and so on. So I won't say 3 cheers for the two-party system or 3 cheers for the primary system, but I'll say 2 cheers.
Yes, got a question right here, and here comes the microphone.
You presented a view that things were falling apart in '68. We hear a lot today about how things are falling apart in the United States. Would you compare and contrast the situations, and do you think we'll bounce back the way we did after '68?
I've been living 50 years in the past for so long now that I've almost lost sight of the president. I don't think I have a particularly intelligent answer to give, except this: as controversial and as deeply divisive as President Clinton was, as President George W. Bush was, as President Obama is, as much intense opposition as each one of those presidents faced, when it came time for them to be inaugurated on January 20th at noon, there were no tanks in the street. There was no coup d'etat. There was no effort by President Clinton when he was leaving office, or President Bush when he was leaving office, at the two-term limit to declare a national emergency and say that the results of the election would be suspended. In other words, I think a lot of the disagreement and dissent we focus on ought to be looked at in the context of a constitutional system, a two-party system that keeps on working sometimes well, sometimes not so well. But I think the fact that we have the luxury in this country of never waking up on the morning of an election and wondering, will this election be allowed to go forward? Never waking up on the morning of a presidential inauguration and wondering, will the outgoing president actually leave and let the new guy come in? To me, that's the headline. The other stuff is news, and it's important, and it's problematic, but to me, it's a great thing that we get to have problems in some areas that don't end up bringing down the whole structure. So I should say there's never been a time when people have been free of criticism of those in power, and that's a good thing too. And I could go on at length about how I wish things were different now. But at the end of the day, maybe this is a sign of my age, I'm kind of glad to know that most of what goes on in the domain of politics and government goes on regardless of the intensity of political polarization between the parties or the nuttiness that you find on some websites or talk radio stations, right? So take that answer as seriously flawed, but the best I've got.
All right, right here.
Professor Nelson, speaking of the resilience of power in terms of entrenched power, I'm interested in your thoughts of the role the FBI played in terms of the movements of the time, their role with campus unrest, civil rights movement, Black Panther Party. I'm interested in your thoughts on how power itself self-sustains itself, especially in terms of the FBI.
Mm-hmm. Well, the FBI, this was the era still of J. Edgar Hoover, whom Kennedy was afraid to fire because Hoover knew about some of his extracurricular activities, some of them shared with the same partners as enjoyed the attention of people like Sam Giancana and Frank Sinatra. So he was in no position to fire Hoover. He knew what Hoover had on him. Johnson famously said about Hoover when his aides would say, "Why don't you fire that guy?" And forgive the PG comment that's about to follow, but he said, "I'd rather have Hoover inside the tent pissing out than outside the tent pissing in," which is, I'll bet if I had just given you that quote and said, which president said that, you'd know like that, right? And then Nixon comes along and is on the same wavelength with his old friend and anti-communist ally, J. Edgar Hoover. But of course, Hoover then, does he die or retire while Nixon is president? But we're talking about the era of J. Edgar Hoover as FBI director, a kind of independent power within Washington, really beyond accountability to the president or Congress or Attorney General, and somebody who viewed the world in terms of an intense domestic communist threat, and and saw that in the civil rights movement, and saw that in the anti-war movement, and saw that in any movement that challenged the status quo. And were FBI agents infiltrated into the civil rights movement? Were wiretaps placed on Martin Luther King's phones by the FBI? Absolutely. Ku Klux Klan, by the way, also infiltrated by the FBI. Were student organizations and other anti-war organizations, did they have spies within them posing as supporters? Yes. Now, this is not a good thing. On the other hand, the civil rights movement managed to accomplish a lot anyway, and the anti-war movement managed to accomplish a lot anyway. In other words, the efforts by Hoover to subvert these movements could not outweigh or undo the strength of these movements at the grassroots. And that, to me, is another reason to be optimistic that even with a guy like Hoover trying to undermine political dissent, political dissent went ahead anyway. And
would you elaborate on the factors that you feel would have led to Humphrey being nominated, even if Kennedy had not been assassinated?
well, at this time, Kennedy entered the race after McCarthy, but like McCarthy, he realized the only way to get anywhere is to enter the primaries, and not so much to win the delegates, because the vast majority of delegates to both parties' conventions at that time were not chosen through the primaries. They were chosen by state party leaders. And so when McCarthy enters the primaries and Kennedy enters the primaries, it's really for the purpose of winning the kind of victories that would cause state party leaders to say, we got to nominate these guys, otherwise we're going to lose the election. That's what JFK did in 1960 to diffuse the Catholic issue, and it worked. That's what Nixon did in 1968 to diffuse the loser image, and it worked. But the fact was that the real weight in the Democratic Convention as late as 1968, and again, this changes immediately afterward, was with state party leaders. And for Humphrey, his bastions of support were organized labor, which was a much bigger deal back then. There were more union members in the United States in 1968 than any other year in our history. So you've got the AFL-CIO and the UAW and the steel workers and the mine workers and so on and so forth, and they're for Humphrey. You've got big city bosses like Daley in Chicago, or Mayor Tate in Philadelphia, or Mayor Barr in Pittsburgh, and they too are organization men. They don't like the idea of Robert Kennedy or anybody else coming along and upsetting the party by challenging an incumbent president and driving him from the race. And then you also had working for Humphrey the South, which, think about Humphrey's debut on the national scene, it was as a champion of civil rights in 1948. By 1968, he was seen as less of a threat to Southern white Democratic conservatives, who controlled the party then, than Kennedy was. There's an interesting memo that I report in the book that Kennedy's own staff people had written for him the day of the California primary. And it sort of showed their estimates of who had how many delegates at that point, and therefore what the challenge would be for Robert Kennedy if he won in California. And as I analyzed that memo, even the Kennedy people had chartered a course to the nomination for Robert Kennedy, which I think was essentially unattainable, because Humphrey had the support of the main power centers at the party at a time when the main power centers in the party could call the shots. So would Robert Kennedy have gotten the nomination if he had lived? By the way, Nixon thought so. And he's a pretty smart guy when it comes to politics. But I come down on the other side. But the truth is, nobody can be sure.
You had a question back there? Okay. Aaron, you got one? Wait for the microphone right there.
I guess one of the things that's different now than '68 is that we've got political advertising.
Yeah.
I don't think we had much what I remember in '68. And it's so much money and so negative all around the country.
Yeah.
Where are we going with this? Is this going to change? And what kind of effect do you think it has on campaigns?
Well, you know, in '68, it was considered to be almost shocking that the candidates ran television commercials that were only 60 seconds long. And now that would be an eternity, right, in a presidential campaign. You get past 15 seconds. So, and the commercials, by the way, were almost all positive in that campaign. Candidates talking about their ideas, commercials talking about the virtues of the candidates rather than attacking the opposition. Where have we come since then? Well, short, snappy, negative ads, right? On the other hand, in '68, if you put a commercial on television, you knew that tens of millions of people were going to see it, because you remember those televisions we had, some of us, back in 1968? For one thing, you had to get up to go change the channel, right? You wonder why we've gotten to be an obese nation.
I still have one of those, by the way.
That's why Skip is in such good shape. That's some of the only walking some people did back. And there were only 3. Well, now think about what it's like to try to reach voters through commercials. If they're watching one of the network shows, there's a very good chance they're recording it, and then when they watch it on replay, they fast forward through the commercials, right? There's a very good chance they're watching HGTV or ESPN or some other alphabet. You know, they talked about FDR's alphabet agencies. We've got the alphabet menu on our televisions now. Young people, a television screen to them is an antique. It's like something they expect to see in a museum because they're watching on their phones or on their tablets. So today it's harder for a candidate to get a message through advertising because how do you reach people where they are? How do you get them to sit and watch what you're telling them? So in that sense, I don't know that advertising is any more effective now or important now than it was back then. I do know it's more expensive now, and I do know it's more negative now, but sometimes that's because the only way you can get somebody's attention is to say something controversial rather than say something positive.
I got a question I want to ask you. The title of your book about resilient America, did you think that was a natural occurrence of just after all the turbulence of early '68? Or do you give Nixon the credit for leading America back?
Well, it's a combination of those two things, but let's not read Nixon out of the story, which is our tendency because we know how the whole Nixon story turned out. But in his first term, Stuart Alsop, who used to be a very prominent columnist for what was then a very prominent magazine, Newsweek, wrote a column about Nixon called President Liberal. Noam Chomsky, the left-wing linguist at MIT, just a few years ago, gave an interview in which he said Nixon was the last liberal president we had. In domestic policy, Nixon realized that those pressures from the left, those dissatisfied voters on the left, needed to be accommodated, and the Democratic Congress was, of course, on the same page. Here's another thing about Nixon, which I think showed extraordinary political shrewdness. Nixon realized that a lot of what was animating the anti-war movement among young people was fear of the draft. I was one of those people, so I'm speaking here in part from experience. Those of us in college were scared to death of being drafted if we flunked out or graduated. And why is it that people who are against the war end up getting out in the streets and campaigning against the war? A lot of it was that fear that if this war is still going when I graduate, I could be over there in Vietnam myself. And I've got a girlfriend, and I've got a sister, and I've got a mother, and they're thinking the same thing. Nixon, when he became president, picked up an idea, by the way, that Goldwater had actually advanced in '64, and that libertarian political thinkers were the chief advocates of: abolish the draft. Go to an all-volunteer force, which I think has turned out to be a success in many ways. But at the time, when Nixon persuaded Congress to abolish the draft, that's when opposition to the war went from being something that manifested itself in active campaigning to something that was not that urgent among those people who felt that way. So we could have a debate about the draft, right, against the all-volunteer force, and that would be interesting. But politically, what Nixon realized was a lot of the opposition that's so angry is anger about what's going to happen to me, my brother, my sister, my kid, when college is over. And he took that off the table, again, with the support of a Democratic Congress.
Well, let's thank Mike very much. This is...
Thank you.
I must say, when he wrote this book and I started reading about it, having been through 1968, like you did, I never thought about being resilient. I just thought about getting through it. But this is a fascinating This is a fascinating topic, and I hope you all will come visit with him and let him sign copies of your book. Mike, thank you very much
Thank
for
you,
being
Skip.
with us.